and letters if you ever need something of that nature. But let me give you my contact information. You can feel free to reach out to my office whenever. The email address is engage@az.gov, engage, ENGAGE, and our phone number is 602-542-4331. And I'll kick it off to the budget guys who can give you all the details on the numbers.
Thanks, Trista. And her team is phenomenal in terms of finding, the answers to the questions that or challenges that Arizonans have. I mean, sometimes they seem unsolvable, and her team happens to figure it out. But so for those of you who don't know me, my name's Matt Gress, and I'm the governor's budget director. And we're pleased to have you here, and we hope to have a good conversation about the budget. There are a lot of good things in it, and so over the next hour, we'll discuss it. I have colleagues of mine here with me to talk about segments so that you don't have to hear me stand up here and talk for the entire time. But we'll go through some of my slides pretty quickly. It's a story that you probably are familiar with. But last November, 1.3 million Arizonans reelected Governor Ducey to a second term in office, 56% of the vote. And they made two priorities abundantly clear. They want their teachers paid and their budgets balanced. And so our budget does that. I'll give you a high-level overview of the national and state economies and our view of where they are headed, as well as that impact on the general fund. Then we'll talk about some current year funding, and then move into the 2020 priorities. From a national perspective, things are looking as good as they've ever looked since before the Great Recession. The blue curve represents gross domestic product growth, which is the size of the economy and its growth rate. We're at 3% for calendar year 2018. That's a growth rate we haven't seen, as I mentioned earlier, since before the Great Recession. And our employment nationally, the unemployment rate is approaching 50-year lows. So that is good news. But we don't want to be overly optimistic here. We have seen significant volatility in the stock market. As you can see in that blue curve, that represents the value of the S&P 500. And then we have these vertical orange lines, which represent rate hikes by the Federal Reserve Board. They did 4 hikes last year, and you can see that it's corresponded in drops in the stock market as investors are trying to figure out where they should put their money with the lowest risk and the highest return. So there is somewhat uneasiness right now on Wall Street, but the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board has acknowledged this situation and said that we do have 2 scheduled rate hikes for calendar year 2019, but we might back off of that depending on how the market is going. So that's positive news from an investment standpoint, which has now caused the stock market to go back up. So maybe not a good idea to look at the stock market day to day. But these long-term trends do suggest that we need to be more cautious in the out years. And the Federal Reserve has adjusted to reflect that uneasiness on Wall Street. The unemployment rate in November relative to September has been revised upward, but it's still pretty low. And then our gross domestic product growth rates are still growing, but not as much compared to the September figures. Arizona is riding high on the economic growth that we're seeing on the national level. We're first in the country in construction, second in manufacturing, third in net in-migration. So people are voting with their feet and choosing Arizona, and they're finding opportunity here because for the 4th month in a row, Arizona's year-over-year job growth, and once we finalize the December figures, it'll be a 5th month in a row. The year-over-year job growth in each of those months has been in excess of 3%. So that 5-month streak of 3% job growth is something we haven't seen since before the Great Recession. And that's really good news for Arizona. The orange curve represents total employment. We're at all-time highs, fueled by that 5-month streak that's sustaining in terms of job growth. And the blue curve represents unemployment, the unemployment rate here in Arizona. We're at 10-year lows. Now you'll notice that it's somewhat flattening out in 2017 and 2018, and that's because more people who are out of the workforce, not looking for any jobs, have seen the possibility that they could actually find a job, and they're reentering and looking, and that's causing the flattening in the unemployment rate. But we've heard from economists at ASU that they could see the unemployment rate dropping to the low 3s, high 2s by the end of this calendar year. So very good news. From a general fund revenue perspective, through November, we're up $175 million compared to what we thought we would take in when we passed the current year budget last May, right? The budget is, as the councilman knows, is out of date the day after it's passed, and you're constantly monitoring whether you're going to be up or down, and right now we're up, and we not only believe we will reach our revenue forecast for this year, but we'll probably exceed it, so we're going to adjust accordingly. And these are the growth rates that we have. 2018 was a really strong year, 7.1% year-over-year revenue growth in the general fund. For comparison purposes, the 10-year average is about 3.2%. So 7.1%, very strong. And it resulted in a high cash balance going into 2019. And as I mentioned earlier, we're ahead of forecast in terms of our revenue collection. So we've revised our growth rate up to 6.8%, but we do back down the growth rates in the out years because we believe reversion to the mean is real, and that 10-year average is probably the sweet spot of where we need to be, so we add caution to our forecast in 2020 through 2022. So this is a really interesting chart. The two lines at the top represent ongoing revenues and ongoing spending. The red curve is ongoing revenues, the blue curve is ongoing, the red is ongoing spending, the blue is ongoing revenues, and when you're spending more than you have in revenues, then you are running a deficit. And we were upside down $3 billion in 2009 as a result of the Great Recession, and we've worked to right the ship. And in 2017, we had the first structural balance since before the Great Recession. Without any new executive initiatives for the current year, if we were just to let things stay as they are, you can see the table at the bottom. We are projected to have an ending cash balance of $1.1 billion and a structural balance of $460 million. Now, when the governor took office 4 years ago, we were facing a projected $1 billion deficit. So a lot of tough decisions, a hard work, and smart planning to get us to this point. And so as we're putting together the budget, we have to make sure that we don't take steps backward and repeat the mistakes of the past. You can see in the mid-2000s, we were in very good we were in a very good revenue environment. The state and counties and cities were flush with cash as a result of people moving here, the housing boom, et cetera, and spending ended up tracking with that revenue growth. You can see that the spending growth rates year over year, 20% roughly in 2006 over 2005. Before 2004, the long run average spending growth rate was about 3.8% compared to 20% in 2006. So we know how the story ended. That wasn't sustainable, and we had to cut significantly in the midst of the Great Recession. There was a temporary 1-cent sales tax, as you might recall, and we mortgaged our state capital, among other things. So you can see the...
Do you mind if we ask a question?
Sure, absolutely.
I see that you're projecting a national GDP at below 3% going forward. Are you going to match that with your projections on state GDP?
That's correct. So, the short-term growth of 3%, as I mentioned earlier, that was driven in large part by one-time fixed business investments. People built new factories, they expanded them. We're not going to see those factories being built every year, so the long-run growth does pull back, and our state gross state product pulls back as well.
How are you defining full employment? At what percentage?
Well, I think that can vary depending on who you ask. Is the natural rate of unemployment? Well, it really depends. We're right now, the state unemployment rate is, I think, in 4.8%, 4.9%. The national rate is is it like 2.7 or it's 3.7? So it's we thought that we had reached the natural the floor of how low the unemployment rate could go last year, and it kept on going down, which gave concern to the feds on how they should adjust their interest rates because they thought that the economy might overheat. So I think that we're hoping to get down to, like I said, the low threes by the end of this year. I think that's kind of where you're going to bottom out in Arizona. I don't think you're going to get any lower than that. And I think that's an optimistic forecast. I think it's going to be somewhere between 3 and 4%. Yeah. The point here is that we've restrained spending growth in the first 3 years of the governor's term. In fiscal year 19, you saw an uptick in spending driven by the teacher pay package as well as restoration of other cuts to K-12 formula funding. And the amount grows to 9.2% in 2020, but there's a 5-year average of 4.5%. And it's worth noting that 9.2% growth rate in spending, over half of it's one time. So we make targeted one-time investments that allow us to have financial flexibility in the out years if our revenue forecasts don't pan out. So at this point, we'll highlight one of the signature components of the governor's budget to prepare us for those out-year uncertainties, and Jacob Wingate with our staff will talk more about it.
Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Jacob Wingate. I'm a budget analyst with OSPB in the governor's office, and we're going to start talking a little bit about the actual issues that the state is facing and how we're going to address those. So Matt kind of gave you the overview of the environment that we're in. Now we're going to start talking about how we're going to approach that environment. One of the things that we've identified is that Arizona is not saving enough for contingencies for a rainy day. Moody's Analytics shows that the 7% cap that's currently in law, that's currently in place, which has been the historic precedent and recommendation, is inadequate. We saw this in the Great Recession. We didn't have enough money to make it through in the way that we needed. So one of the things that we're going to see in the executive budget addressing this concern is what I think is one of the most exciting parts of the budget. I realize from a less technical perspective it may not be, but we're going to make a deposit of $542 million into the rainy day fund. This is the largest single deposit ever made into the fund, and it's going to bring the fund balance to historically high levels. It's going to bring the balance up to roughly 9% of general fund revenues, getting us closer and closer to the recommended amount, which is slightly over 10%. We're also going to change the statutory cap on how much money can be in that fund from 7% to 10%. Using this initiative is going to secure Arizona's fiscal future. So when we do see an economic slowdown in the future, we're going to be able to recover stronger and faster than ever before. Another hallmark here of responsible government is taking care of our debt. In 2010, the state was facing significant operating deficits. We took out $1.4 billion in debt, and we leveraged that against some of our state assets, particularly our buildings. Since that time, we've paid off $474 million, and we are in a much better fiscal position, and we have a better credit rating than we did at the time. So taking all those factors together, we identified an opportunity to refinance that debt, and that's going to save taxpayers over $100 million from fiscal year 2020 to 2030. Also, very importantly, it's going to release some of the most public assets that we have from the collateral basket, if you will. Things that are currently being held as collateral no longer will be.
Jacob, what's our current state credit rating?
I think we're at AA3, do you know?
Depends on.
There's different, yeah, because of the different
It's
rating
AAA
agencies.
plus, or it's a double A plus.
Moody's and Fitch.
Double A plus from S&P, and I want to say we are triple A.
I think we're at a 3.
3?
Yes.
I'll have to look at that.
That's the projection following this refinance. So much better than we have been. To close out the current fiscal year, the executive budget also includes some additional funding for issues that we're facing right now, totaling $55 million. Chief amongst these is the School Facilities Board building renewal grants. We've seen huge increases in the number of the amount of need for replacements, and Quessie's going to talk about this a little more in detail later, but that's going to help us put our schools in a better place. Another big issue for us is health insurance for university employees. We needed to increase the trust fund for our health insurance for employees in the last year. Incidentally, ended up pulling tuition dollars into operating costs. So we're going to provide more general fund to backfill that, free up those tuition dollars, let the universities use those in a better way. Moving on really to these priorities, the big ticket items, big things that we're looking at. As Matt said, we have a $1.1 billion cash balance. Once we account for all the baseline spending, the prior commitments, the 20 by 2020 teacher salary increases, half of that balance, as we said, is going into the rainy day fund. That's the rainy day fund deposit. And as I said, that's going to secure Arizona's fiscal future in a way that we haven't been prepared for in the past. The remainder is going into these executive initiatives. And as Matt said, over half of that amount is one-time in nature. That's one-time expenditures. That's going to give us the best fiscal flexibility going into the future. So as the environment changes, we're going to be able to pivot and move as we need to. You can also see that, yes, 30% are one time. Spending at a glance here, this chart on the left, you can see of those initiatives, that $500 million going to initiatives, 50% is going into education. It's a huge investment in our education, and when you look at the baseline spending plus those initiatives, our prior commitments plus our new spending, you can see the total education rises to $70 million, or 70%, which is very important for the governor. This is going to get a little technical, so bear with me, but when we're looking at the structural and cash balances of the state, you can see here the revenues are in blue, and the spending is in the orange or the red. The solid colors are the ongoing. This is something that we're expecting every year. It's going to be continuing on. And then the dashed bars indicate one time. So you can see we're looking at strong revenue growth through fiscal year 22. And we're going to have one of the longest cash and structural balances, best periods we've seen since the Great Recession. The numbers below the graph here you can see reflect the ending cash and structural balances for the state. We're looking at $109 million ending cash balance in 2020. This does dip down in 2021 as we continue the last step of phasing in the teacher salary increases. The governor's budget exhibits a number of hallmarks of responsible government, investing in various state assets and infrastructure. One of the most important among these, I think that you're going to agree is very important, is expanding I-17. Through using the public safety fee, the executive budget is able to stop diverting dollars that should be going into transportation infrastructure that was going into supporting the highway patrol. With the freed up money, we're going to be able to invest in projects that are going to reduce congestion and improve highway safety. I-17 is a highlight of those projects. $130 million between fiscal year 2020 and 2022. That's going to accelerate and expand the construction of a third highway lane on north and southbound segments of I-17 between Anthem and Black Canyon City. This is in addition to the $193 million we're being invested through the State Transportation Board's plan and the existing expansion project that's already in place. This is going to put us years ahead of schedule and expand the safe and efficient roads on this vital corridor. You're going to see, we anticipate growth in economic activity as the infrastructure is in a better shape. Along those same lines, we're looking at increasing the budget for preventive road maintenance. We know that for every $1 we spend on preventive maintenance, we save $6 on if we waited too long and had to replace the road and it was crumbling. We started this in the 2019 budget. You can see that we increased from 29% of the need to 79% of the need. In 2020, we're going to be funding that at 100% of the anticipated need. And as we expand the lifespan of our roads, that's going to, again, keep the economy moving.
This is the state how are you distributing? Through MPOs or what?
Partially through the State Transportation Board's plan. And then, Matt, do you have other ideas on how that's going to be distributed?
I think that they've identified their roads that they would deem as good. And I believe 39% of their roads qualify as good that would be subject to the preventative maintenance. So
So this is through ADOT.
this would be through ADOT, yes.
Yep.
Yeah, on state highways. But there's also the HERF monies
Right.
that the locals have.
That's not in this.
It is fully restored in this budget.
Right.
Yep. Moving on, also the digital highway is very important, and we believe that an investment is due for that. As many of you know, that the high-speed internet connectivity is far behind in the rural areas compared to the more urban areas of the state. According to federal communications data, over 825,000 Arizonans don't have the opportunity to subscribe to high-speed internet connections. This is not a luxury, it's a necessity for the 21st century economy. Only 10.6% of Arizonans statewide can subscribe to the super fast gigabit internet connection. As you can see, Arizona lags behind our neighbors to the north and west when it comes to this access. So the executive budget includes $7 million restoring funding for grants that will attract, expand, retain Arizona enterprises in fiscal year 2020. And of that money, $3 million will be dedicated to establishing a competitive rural broadband development grants program. This is going to provide critical funding for local projects across the state to develop that high-speed internet access. As well, without increasing the appropriation, the Arizona Commerce Authority is going to be establishing a new state broadband director. That's going to be the single point of contact for developing and implementing the state broadband strategy. Another key aspect for local governments here is financial relief for the Arizona counties. The 2019 fiscal year budget included many initiatives to restore funding to the county budgets. You can see here in the left column those issues. The 2020 fiscal year executive budget continues that trend, identifying that there are areas of law that we can repeal which are currently requiring counties to contribute $11.2 million toward the operating costs of the Department of Juvenile Corrections. By eliminating this cost sharing and as well as other funding, the counties are going to be receiving $19 million in ongoing cost reductions in fiscal year 2020. Finally, another important infrastructure investment that's going to help boost Arizona business is increasing the produce capacity at the Mariposa port of entry in Nogales. This was one of the largest ports for fresh produce originating from Mexico, but right now we're seeing that there's a lack of cold storage that would accommodate the inspection of temperature-sensitive products, berries, avocados, seafood, some pharmaceuticals. Historically, Nogales was one of the highest annual value ports of entry, especially for fruit imports. But as you can see in this chart, we've dropped down to third in the mid-2000s due to this lack of refrigeration capacity. So to address this problem, the executive budget includes $700,000 to build a cold room within the existing inspection facility, and local partners are also going to be matching that with another $300,000. This is going to make Arizona better equipped to compete with the other border states as carriers decide which port of entry they want to enter through. A University of Arizona study estimates this new economic activity could lead to an estimated increase of $27 to even $30 million in gross state product, as well as $3.7 to $4.1 million in additional state and local tax revenues. Next up, my colleague Kwesi is going to talk to you about some of our education initiatives.
Thank you, Jacob. My name is Kwesi Pasley, and I'll be going over some of the higher education and K-12 investments in the fiscal year 2020 executive budget. So as Jacob previously mentioned, when you look at all the initiatives that we have in the 2020 budget, 50% of those initiatives falls under K-12 and higher education. And when you consider our prior commitments baseline funding, that goes to 70%. And so here, this chart is showing all the new investments that are being made in K-12 education, $637 million total. You see here that we're going to expand results-based funding, building renewal grants, school safety, and a career and technical education incentive program. And I'll talk about a number of these initiatives in later slides. Also, just want to point out that the final year of the Teacher Pay 20 by 2020 is going to be fulfilled in this year as well. Moving to higher education, $104 million in higher education investments. Will be providing a investment for universities, as Jacob pointed out, for the Health Insurance Trust Fund, so that the universities can use those dollars into critical operations and other needs. General operating and expenditures and capital improvements, that's $27 million for 2020. And the Teachers Academy, that's one of the governor's biggest initiatives to solve the state's critical shortage of teachers. We will expand that program, and then we invest in our community colleges, both at Pima and Maricopa. So for our teacher raises, the executive budget delivers on this promise to provide more resources to Arizona's public K-12 education system. The 2019 budget established a 5-year plan to restore $371 million suspended from the basic state aid formula for additional assistance. The 2020 executive budget continues to implement the executive's plan here to restore additional assistance by providing $68 million for the second installment of the funding. As previously mentioned, the executive makes good on the promise to provide the teacher pay raise of 20% by school year 2020, which is a total investment of $646 million in Arizona's teachers. The 2020 budget includes an additional $165 million investment for teacher salaries in the baseline, which means this funding is permanent and will be adjusted for inflation annually. As previously mentioned, we expand results-based funding. Results-based funding was introduced in 2018, fiscal year 2018, to reward schools for high student achievement and to incentivize the expansion and replication of high-performing schools. So in fiscal years 18 and 19, results-based funding was distributed to schools that scored in the top 10% of the statewide assessment AZ merit. As you can see on this graph, based on the funding provided, $39.2 million to 298 schools in fiscal year 18, and $38.3 million to 285 schools in FY19. Schools that received a letter grade A designation qualify for results-based funding under the current funding formula. Now, the executive expands the funding formula to include B schools with 60% for higher or higher free or reduced price lunch participation. And so here, the executive provides $60 million to support this expansion of results-based funding to an estimated 675 schools in fiscal year 2020, totaling $98 million in additional financial support for those schools. Having safe schools is a priority for Governor Ducey, and he released the Safe Arizona Schools Plan in March of this year, which called for making school safety a top priority by investing more in mental and behavioral health resources at schools, as well as increasing the number of school resource officers serving school campuses. So during the most recent cycle for SROs, 203 schools applied for officers, but only 114 actually received them due to limited funding. So the executive budget actually fills that gap with $9 million to fund SROs for the remaining 89 schools. It also includes $6 million to establish a new school safety grant program that awards school counselors or social workers to public schools in a manner similar to the school resource officer grants. The fiscal year 2021 baseline will include an additional increase in funding to double the grant program and to further expand access to these critical resources. As you can see from the bottom graphic here, school counselor caseloads will decrease by 17% as a result of this additional investment. Career and technical education is very important to our students, high school students who come out of high school with some type of post-secondary educational certification. And so the 2020 executive budget expands on that for providing workforce development for those students by investing $10 million into a CTE program. Now, this program will incentivize schools by providing them with $1,000 per pupil to schools that graduate students with an approved credential. Those credentials will be identified by the Arizona Commerce Authority. So they will list a few certificates that are definitely needed in Arizona and that will be useful to our growing economy. And so students who actually go into one of those programs, they come out with a certification, the school will be rewarded with a $1,000 per pupil incentive there. Charter school accountability. The State Board for Charter Schools grants charter status and oversees over 500 charter schools statewide. Over 17% of Arizona students attend charter schools, and enrollment continues to grow. The executive budget provides $786,000 for the State Board for Charter Schools to hire 10 additional staff members to conduct more frequent school site visits and to address operational, academic, and financial performance issues. The board is currently finalizing the financial performance framework that will be used to determine the new intervention process for schools that do not meet financial performance standards. These additional staff members will allow the board to implement its revised financial performance framework to ensure charter holders sound financial management. As a result of this additional investment, the board will be able to inspect an estimated 65% of charter sites for operational, academic, and financial performance annually, compared to the 25% rate that it currently is under the staffing levels that we currently have. As our schools begin to age, we find that we're getting more building renewal applications. And so as you can see from this chart here, building school applications have more than tripled since 2013. So in the past 6 years, after the passage of Students First in 1998, the state completed $1.3 billion in emergency and deficiency corrections projects to bring the schools up to standards, building systems, and square footage, structural quality standards. Additionally, $934 million in new schools were completed during the same 1999 through 2004 period. These school building systems, such as roofs, HVAC systems, are aging, and of course, they just need significant repair or replacement. And so the executive budget goes further on that by providing additional monies for that. As you can see from this graph, the gray line across is the FY 2019 appropriation, and that is at $51 million. The orange line there is showing where we currently are in the fiscal year. So as you can see, we're getting quite close to the appropriation. And so, as mentioned earlier, a supplemental will be provided for this in the amount of $25 million, and it'll bring this total up to 76 million, excuse me. For new school construction in the aftermath of the recession, the legislature changed the standards for constructing new schools from funding schools that were needed in 2 to 3 years to constructing them only needed in the current year. Given the delay until the effective date of the appropriation and then a 2-year construction schedule, this means that children over a school's capacity could be an improvised space for 3 years while the new school is being constructed. The executive budget returns to the pre-2013 standard for constructing new schools. Based on current estimates for out-year construction needs, the executive estimates that this one-time catch-up will cost $99 million, which is on top of the current level needed of $92 million, current law need of $92 million. The executive budget includes a total new school construction cost of $191 million in fiscal year 2020 for the school districts that you can see on the slide here. Please note that using the newer information, SFB staff will be updating cost estimates for the out years of schools in the next couple of months. Moving on to some of the investments made in higher education. As you know, Arizona is currently experiencing a teacher shortage, and in 2017, along with the state's 3 public universities, Governor Ducey announced the Arizona Teachers Academy. The fiscal year 2020 budget provides additional funding for this program, or provides funding for this program at the amount of $21 million. And so based on this, we're going to expand the program in a number of ways. So expanded eligibility. Currently, students in the College of Education are only allowed to participate. We're going to open this up to STEM majors at these universities and also to education majors outside of the College of Education. Right now, universities can provide a level of benefits that they would like to. In 2020, the executive budget provides this funding amount to make sure that 4 years of benefits are offered. So if a student comes in and participates in the academy beginning in freshman year, they'll have 4 years covered. After institutional aid, grant aid, any sort of federal grants, scholarships have been applied, we'll fill that last dollar amount in for 4 years. Because we have such a critical shortage of teachers in certain areas such as STEM, special education, rural, low-income schools, tribal schools, we'll incentivize students to go into one of those critical need areas by providing a $1,000 bonus for no more than 2 years, so their junior and senior years. If they plan to go into one of those environments, we'll say, well, here you can have a $1,000 bonus, a stipend that they'll be able to use for school expenses while they're currently getting their education. And then finally, realizing that we need just a lot of teachers, we open up the academy to other students, including community college post-baccalaureate students. So those students who have already graduated, they have a bachelor's degree, they've decided they want to go and become a teacher. We'll allow them to go to the community college to obtain that teacher certification, and we'll also open it up to non-resident students as well. So our targeted workforce investments, this includes investments made at Pima Community College District and Pima Community College. So Pima Community College has one aviation technology program. They have only one of two in the state. And realizing that the aerospace industry is very important in southern Arizona and to the economy down there, the executive budget makes a $20 million investment for them to expand that facility. That will double the capacity of students there. It'll provide more training opportunities to allow companies that currently select their employees from those programs. And then at Maricopa, we know that in the Phoenix metropolitan area, some of the healthcare specialties are expected to grow by 24% on average, according to the Bureau for Labor Statistics. And so Maricopa Community College District, they have a number of facilities that work with healthcare specialty simulators and training opportunities for students. And so the $6 million investment here will allow them to expand specialty areas offered. They'll be offering operating room, telemetry, home care specialists, ICU, to keep up with the region's demands in those healthcare specialties. And then, as mentioned before, $35 million will go to allow universities to apply some operating and capital improvements as a cost of educating a resident student, $30 million to hold the universities harmless from the future increase in the state's health insurance trust fund. And then we know that education is very important for those that are in the armed services, and for promotion opportunities, they need to be able to advance themselves in the education, any sort of education. And so Arizona is currently the only state that does not have a National Guard tuition reimbursement program. This program was dropped in 2011, of course, because of the recession and needing to cut funding. So in 2020, the executive brings $1 million for this program to those members of the National Guard. I'll introduce Matt to come back to the podium, who will go through health and welfare and the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Kwesi. And to follow up on your question, Councilman Blair, I gave you the credit rating.
Seat, I'm actually good.
Oh, Councilman Good. I gave you the credit rating for a subset of one of our state agencies and the debt that we have there. Our state rating with Moody's is AA2. And with S&P, it's AA. 25 states have a credit rating that is higher than Arizona's. 15 states have the same rating, and 9 states have a credit rating lower than ours, or they're not rated. And 2 of the primary components that are, we have a strong economic outlook. We have a stable, positive economic outlook in the out years, but they're concerned about our reserves, which we're addressing with the rainy day fund.
We actually have a statutory cap at 7%.
We do, yeah. And I think that was adjusted back in the 90s. The fund was created in 1991, the rainy day fund, but they say you need more in your rainy day fund and your pensions. You're
Is that a
unfunded.
proposal for the current legislature to move that up to 10%?
It is, yeah. So we've seen, there are arguments on both sides of should we be saving that much money. The Treasurer's Office, the credit ratings agencies, Pew has weighed in on this, and our plan would allow us to weather 7 out of the 10 recession scenarios for a period of 6 years, which is the amount of time that analysts say we need in order to recover.
I think, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but the National Municipal Finance Officers Association recommends 10 to 15%. Is that correct?
Actually, I think their current best practice is higher than that.
And-
Well, good, we're approaching acceptability then, thanks.
So I'm just going to breeze through some of these really quick, and if you have questions, I can come back to them later, but just for the sake of getting through the presentation and getting to have a conversation, we'll go through this. We currently have on the books a law that says if the federal match rate for our kids' care program drops below 100%. The feds pay us 100% of the cost to cover kids whose parents have incomes below a certain threshold. We have a 2017 law that says if the feds decide to pay less than 100%, then we have to freeze the program and not allow any new kids to join, even though they would qualify for the program. That would result in 6,000 kids losing their insurance in 2020. That number would increase to 26,000 kids in 2022. So we reverse that policy and protect this important program for Arizona children. We increase the child care subsidy rate. This is the rate that working parents and foster parents receive to help pay a portion of the cost of child care if they meet certain income requirements. Our current rate is based on a 2000 market rate study. We're proposing to modernize that to go to 2010. So it's not 2018, but it's a step in the right direction. And our rate, you can see how the max rate compares to others. The average rate is about $428 under our proposal. The current average rate's $365. If you were to look at child care in Maricopa County, the average monthly cost is about $1,000. So our average rate picks up right now $365, and we'd increase that to $425. So depending on their income qualifications, that I think will make a significant impact. And we're also going to address the wait list. About 5,000 kids currently cannot receive access to this subsidy. So our proposal would boost this. And this money is what the feds have given us for the child care subsidy program. So we have the money sitting in our account, and we're asking to spend it immediately. But we're doing it in a way that we have half going to the wait list, half going to provider rate increases, so that this is sustainable in the long term. We're addressing the Adult Protective Services caseload growth. That red chart represents the increase in the number of cases of abuse and neglect that have been referred to Adult Protective Services for seniors and vulnerable adults. And so we're addressing the caseload, so we have enough investigators to take care of these complaints or cases brought to them. The blue curve represents Maricopa County, but I'll talk about the statewide issue. These are home and community-based services. These are your Meals on Wheels. This is your adult day supervision at adult day centers. These are crucial services that allow seniors and vulnerable adults to remain as independent as possible. And there's been a backlog since the recession. 1270 in Maricopa County. It's about 3,000 statewide. We're working to address that using some federal funds and moving things around to make that work. $1 million to establish a prenatal care telemedicine grant. Our rural providers need access to equipment, telemedicine equipment in particular, to provide adequate health care to expectant mothers. And in our rural areas, we know that that is just not happening. So expectant mothers have to travel to urban areas to get that treatment. And we work to address that. And you can see that the heat map, the darker counties represent where access is limited. We provide $1 million to help bolster our suicide prevention program for veterans. The Be Connected program is a 24/7 hotline that takes calls and helps veterans connect with resources to help them deal with mental health issues. Right now, the share of veterans committing suicide relative to the total suicides in our state is above the national average, and that qualified us for a federal grant a few years ago to help us address this problem. So we're wanting to continue that at work. DCP, you may have heard of this, the governor's water plan is his top priority. The drought contingency plan is an agreement of the 7 lower basin Colorado River states, the federal government, and Mexico to conserve water and protect the elevation in Lake Mead. You can see the blue line represents where it's currently projected to go by 2027. Once you get below 1,000 feet, it's called, you get into a situation called dead pool, where the water can't get through the Hoover Dam, which obviously has an impact on your hydroelectricity production, as well as the Colorado River system in general. So what we're trying to do here is stabilize the elevations. They will decline. It's just that the hydrology models suggest this. But we're including $30 million to pay those who are legally entitled to Colorado River water to not take that water and keep it in Lake Mead, which gives us a glide path to help prepare for a drier future in Arizona. We also include $5 million this year in agriculture infrastructure projects that can help build wells, groundwater wells, so that you can transition some of the irrigation users onto groundwater. Our public safety package, the chief thing among this is the public safety pay raise. We're including $74 million for this. Most of it is going to the Department of Corrections and the Department of Public Safety. But you can see we have several other public safety agencies benefiting from this. And you have child services, child safety, and health services. And I'll talk about a few of those. But the vacancy rate in our corrections system for the number of filled security posts is pretty high. It was at 1% in 2011. It's at about 15% now. Once you reach that 20% level, it becomes incredibly dangerous in our facilities. So we're including a 10% pay raise in year one with a 5% planned pay raise in year two, so a 15% package here for our corrections officers. We're also having a hard time retaining troopers and recruiting them. You can see where DPS pay is relative to other law enforcement agencies. So we're including a 10% pay raise for those positions. Reducing turnover at our Department of Juvenile Corrections, 100% turnover in last year. I mean, these entry-level youth correction officers are doing rehabilitation work here to try to get these kids back on the right track. You have 100% turnover. How are you supposed to have sustained improvement? So we're including a 15% pay raise there. A 9% pay raise for our caseworkers in the Department of Child Safety. As you can see in this chart here, the red line represents the number of filled positions. The blue line represents the legislative benchmark. We've been unable to reach that, and we believe pay is a huge issue in addressing reaching that legislative benchmark. These are some other key positions. We have a 50% vacancy rate in substance abuse counselors in our prisons right now, and you have a number of inmates who need substance abuse treatment if they're going to have a shot of having a real second chance upon release. We also have a 25% vacancy rate in our teachers, so we're including a pay package for them. This is we can skip over it, but it's more of our commitment to recidivism. $12 million in public safety investments, more troopers to patrol our highways, and more equipment, vehicle replacement for DPS. This is the public safety fee. I believe Mr. Campbell authored the bill that put this into effect, but we just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of how it was calculated. You see what the total budget is for the Department of Public Safety's Highway Patrol Division. You find out how many vehicles qualify, and you divide that number, and you get $32. But the governor's goal is to ensure that $32 stays, does not go beyond 32, while making critical public safety investments in our troopers, trooper pay, and vehicle replacement. So we front load general fund dollars in 2020 to cover the portion of our public safety investments that would not be covered by the natural growth in the public safety fee revenues, because we have a natural growth in registrations in general. More people are moving here to Arizona, they're bringing their cars with them, or people who haven't come of age yet to drive are now coming of age and getting a car, which comes with a new registration. So there's a natural growth, and that's represented in the bars there, the blue bars and the red bars. So that will eventually cover the total cost for public safety, but in the meantime, we're including general fund support to hold the $32 at that level and not increase it beyond it. So where does that leave us? Well, we have 460 in the 2020 column. You can see Above the 2019 base spending, we're adding $461 million in baseline changes, enrollment growth, the 20 by 2020 teacher pay plan, et cetera. $538 million in new initiatives, so it's a total spending package of about $1 billion, of which most of it is one time for targeted strategic investments that provide us flexibility in the out years to weather any economic uncertainty. Total spending of $11.4 billion with a rainy day fund deposit of $542 million. That leaves us with an ending balance of $109 million and a structural balance of $234 million. So that is a pretty strong place to be in, given that we've been structurally unbalanced since before the Great Recession. The governor said in his State of the State 2 weeks ago that his budget would fund the things that are important to Arizonans: public safety, child safety, education, above and beyond inflation, protecting Arizona's fiscal future with a rainy day fund deposit. And so we're doing the things that matter here. I wanted to acknowledge my staff, of course, those who came with me, and those who are back in Phoenix who helped put this budget together. It's available online, azgovernor.gov, as well as azospb.gov. And with that, happy to take any more questions if there was anything that was unclear or that you were curious about.
The rainy day fund.
Yeah.
So, when is that used and how much per year is it used, or has it just been growing and we haven't touched it since the recession?
So we depleted it in the recession. You didn't even make it through a month, a year with that amount of money. In 2012 or 2013, we made a large deposit into the rainy day fund of about $200 million. I think in the next year we made another $200 million deposit. So it's been at $450 million or so since 2013. We've made really no deposits into the rainy day fund. And in fact, some of the interest from the fund has not been used, it hasn't been retained in the fund. We've used the interest on other spending. So the last two economic recessions that we've experienced since the rainy day fund was created in 1991, it hasn't been enough. And in fact, and you can see what's interesting here is that we've been at the 7%, we were at the 7% threshold of general fund revenues. You can see here that we were at the 7% mark before the recession of the early 2000s, and we were there before the Great Recession, and every time we depleted, and we had to do massive cuts. And obviously here you can see the Great Recession really erased what we had. We included roughly a $200 million investment in 2012, another $200 million investment in 2013, and then that balance has stayed flat over that time period. So we recognize that the 7% threshold isn't enough. People say we need between 10 and 15%. We get to 9% with our proposal here. So we actually get up here. But putting $1 billion in is a great start. That's why our credit ratings agencies always ask us about how your rainy day fund is doing, making sure you have reserves on hand. So that's really kind of the approach that we're taking, because it's when you enter a recession, it's a liquidity issue. You run out of cash, and then that results in the rollover, the K-12 rollover. You may have heard of this, where we say, all right, well, we'll pay you for 3 months of your costs next year, next fiscal year, right? So your payments that you should have received in June, you'll receive them in July. So it's a gimmick that went along with that, but we were out of cash, so that in part because we didn't have a sufficient rainy day fund to address it. Does that help answer your question?
Another question for our education presentation. On the certification of each student, the $1,000, is there are limitations on what the school can do that? Is that designated to go back into that program, or do they have the freedom to use that $1,000 per student that receives certification any way they want?
So I think our goal is to help expand the seats in a classroom for the CTE courses that are workforce relevant. And to also say, all right, well, you already offer manufacturing-related courses, but you don't offer construction. Use that $1,000 per pupil to expand your course offering so that students have access to construction-related CTE courses. So we want to be as flexible as we can with this funding to incentivize and expand CTE coursework throughout Arizona's education system. Anything else? Well, thanks for coming out. We really appreciate it. And again, if you have any questions, let us know. We have Trista here. She's with she's the director of the Governor's Office for Constituent Services. So if you have other non-budget related issues that you need to get hashed out, she's the individual to go to. And with that, we'll stick around for a little while. Yeah.
Well, I guess I have a question here. So what's the process now?
So.
I know it goes to the legislatures and then it's the give and take, who wants what.
Right. So we released our budget, and right now, the legislature is sending us a lot of questions, a lot of questions. And they do that every year, but they're trying to understand exactly what we have in it. It's $11.3 billion spending plan, so it's to be expected. And then they will record what they interpret as the executive proposal relative to their own baseline. It's a similar book that they put out about what it would take to operate government at the statutory levels. And then we'll go back and forth, and legislators will say that they like something or they don't like something, and we'll either agree or disagree, or they'll want something else involved in that. And that will happen over the next several months. But we meet with the appropriators to talk to them about their views on the budget, if they have any questions.
Does
And
it look pretty comfortable for the rainy day fund? I've heard some discussion.
well, there's a healthy discussion. There are three major areas that I believe the Republican majority in the House has pointed out. They want to pay down debt. They want to reduce the K-12 rollover. And they want to do some rainy day fund, but they only want to go to the 7% cap, is my understanding. But that's not the accepted. There are some members within the caucus that may hold different views. But if we're at the end of a business cycle here and revenues fall, you need liquidity. So where is the best place to get that? It would be in the rainy day fund, as opposed to reinstituting a K-12 rollover or selling off buildings that you've just paid off with debt reduction. So that's our view. Is we're at the end of the business cycle. How do you best prepare for an uncertain fiscal future? It's to have cash in the bank. So, any other questions?
What is our percentage of debt relative to our total budget and general fund?
It's a good question. I'll have to get back to you on that. But it's relatively modest, and that's one of the strengths that that has led to us to have a credit rating upgrade. And it's also worth noting, and I've mentioned this to members of the legislature, we're going to pay off 80% of all of our debt within the next decade. 80% of the debt that we have will be retired right now. It's because we're not issuing any new debt, so the legislature is very debt averse, and we're aggressively making debt service payments on that. So I think from a debt perspective, the credit ratings agencies look at us as pretty good. Their concern, again, is reserves and your pensions and the unfunded liabilities associated with those pensions.
I'd like to add one comment. When you look at that one slide, when it shows the percentage of veterans suicide relative to the entire population, Arizona has a high percentage of veterans in their population. Prescott probably has one of the highest percentages in the country. So when you look at the average percentage of suicide within the population as a whole, you would expect that with a high percentage of veterans, that would be a bigger number. So if that, your comments can be a little bit tempered when you bring that slide up.
Sure.
To balance that number in context, I think it would be appreciated.
Absolutely. We do have more veterans, per capita than many other states, as mentioned here, but we still are above the national average, and that balances everything else out. So it is concerning to us that we are above the national average in terms of the share of veteran suicides. And that was one of the reasons why we did qualify for the federal VA grant to address it. But your point is well taken. When, of course, you're going to have a larger number of X as a percentage of Y if you have more X's than everybody else. So that's a point well taken. Yes.
So I believe today Representative Campbell just dropped a bill to increase tax on gasoline. And it's a pretty hefty tax. I mean, it's like 10 cents this year, 10 cents next year, and then another 5 cents for a total of 25 cents in 3 years. Will the governor support that? And how does that affect your budget?
I'll have to refer you to our legislative team. We typically don't comment on bills that are pending before the legislature, and I'm not familiar with the senior leadership's thinking on their view of this. Anything else? Well, thanks for coming out and spending your afternoon with us. We really do appreciate it.